Imagine this. You are the most brilliant chief engineer in the British aeronautical industry. Your engines power the fighter jets that defend England. Your designs are licensed in 17 countries. You are at the pinnacle of success. Then in 1942, in the midst of World War II, your own company fires you. Why? Because you defied orders. Because you became obsessed with a technology everyone said was impossible. The sleeve valve, a concept so complex that many engineers believed it impractical. But Roy Fedden wouldn't accept the impossible, and the engine he created, against all odds, would become one of the most important weapons of the Allied victory. This is the story of the man who gambled everything. And one, stay with me. Alfred Hubert Roy Fedden was born on June 6, 1885, in Stoke Bishop, Bristol, England. His family was prosperous and influential in the region. His father was a successful merchant. His older brother, Roy Fedden, would become a well-known artist. The Fedden family was the first in the area to own an automobile, a fact that would deeply impact young Roy. Roy attended Clifton College, one of England's most prestigious schools. But unlike his artist brother, Roy didn't excel academically. His teachers described him as a mediocre student. His grades were poor. His only passion was sports, especially rugby and cricket. When the time came to decide his future, the family expected Roy to follow tradition and join the army. It was the natural path for young men from respectable families. But Roy surprised everyone with a radical announcement. He wouldn't join the army. He would become an engineer. For a conservative Victorian family, this was a shocking choice. Engineering was manual labor. It was a profession for the working classes, not for young men from prosperous families. But Roy was stubborn, always had been. Once he made a decision, no one could change his mind. In 1903, at 18, Roy entered an engineering apprenticeship. He worked in workshops. He got his hands dirty with grease and oil. He learned every aspect of machines, how they worked, why they failed, how to improve them. It wasn't glamorous work, but Roy loved every minute of it. What Roy lacked in academic ability, he made up for in practical obsession. He could look at a machine and immediately see its flaws. He could visualize improvements. He had a rare gift, the ability to think in 3 dimensions, to see how complex mechanical components would interact. In 1906, at just 21 years old, Roy completed his apprenticeship and immediately did something extraordinary. He designed a complete automobile from scratch. Engine, transmission, chassis, suspension, everything. He convinced a local company, Bristol Aeroplane, to hire him and produce his design. The car was called the Shamrock. It was a moderate commercial success. But more importantly, it established Roy Fedden as an exceptionally talented engineer. At just 22, he was appointed chief engineer of Bristol Aeroplane, an extraordinary position for someone so young. Roy developed several car models for Bristol Aeroplane. Each incorporated technical innovations that were ahead of their time. He didn't accept conventional solutions. If something could be improved, it should be improved. This philosophy would define his entire career. But in 1914, when World War I broke out, Roy's focus shifted dramatically. The war created massive demand for aircraft engines. Bristol Aeroplane began manufacturing them. And Roy Fedden, the determined young automotive engineer, had his first brush with aviation. It was love at first sight. Aircraft engines were more complex, more challenging, and more exciting than automotive engines. They operated under extreme conditions. They needed to be lightweight yet powerful, reliable yet high performance. Roy immediately recognized that he had found his true calling. This shift from automobiles to airplanes would change not only Roy Fedden's life, it would change the course of 20th century military history. In 1915, Roy Fedden made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of his life. Together with his technical designer Leonard Butler, he began designing completely new aircraft engines. The partnership between Fedden and Butler was extraordinary. Butler was the detail-oriented man, meticulous, precise, capable of translating Fedden's visions into perfect technical drawings. Fedden was the visionary, the man who saw what could be. They became inseparable. For the next 20 years, they worked side by side, so much so that their engine parts were marked FB, Fedden-Butler, in recognition of their shared contribution. During World War I, Fedden and Butler designed two engines. The first was the Mercury, a 14-cylinder radial engine with a single helical arrangement. The second was the Jupiter, a conventional 9-cylinder radial engine capable of producing approximately 400 horsepower. Both engines were revolutionary in their designs, but initially no one was interested. The war was ending. The British government was cancelling military contracts. Aircraft engine manufacturers were closing their doors. In September 1918, one of the Mercury engines was experimentally installed in a Bristol Scout. The performance was spectacular, easily outperforming the competing Sunbeam Arab. Finally, there was interest, but it was too late. The war ended in November 1918. With the end of the war, Cosmos Engineering, the company where Fedden and Butler worked, quickly became insolvent. There were no more repair contracts. There were no new engine orders. The company was bankrupt, but the British Air Ministry recognized Fedden and Butler's talent. It recognized the quality of their designs. So the ministry let it be known that it would be quite pleased if the Bristol Aeroplane Company acquired Cosmos Engineering. Bristol was reluctant, but under government pressure it finally agreed. In 1920, Bristol acquired the Mercury designs, 7 complete engines, the entire Cosmos facility, and, most importantly, Roy Fedden and his design team. All for just £15,000. Sir George White, Bristol's director, later remarked that it was the best bargain in the company's history. But even so, Bristol only did so after being persuaded by the government. Bristol quickly found a role for the larger design, the Jupiter. The engine went into production at Bristol's new engine plant in Filton, and it became an extraordinary commercial success. The Jupiter was reliable, powerful, and relatively easy to maintain. It was licensed to manufacturers in 17 countries, including Nome-et-Rhône in France, in 1922, the first license. Jupiter engines powered military and civilian aircraft worldwide. Roy Fedden, the young engineer who had been rejected by academia, became one of the highest-paid engineers in Europe. His salary in the 1930s was extraordinary, even surpassing that of many company directors. But money was never Fedden's motivation. His motivation was technical perfection, solving problems others considered impossible. And in the 1920s, Fedden identified a problem that would obsess him for the next decade: the limitations of conventional valves. By the late 1920s, the Jupiter engine was becoming outdated. New designs demanded more power. But there was a fundamental problem. The valves, conventional engines use poppet valves, mushroom-shaped valves that open and close to control air and fuel flow. They are actuated by a cam and spring. This system has been used since the early days of internal combustion engines. But poppet valves had severe limitations in high-performance aircraft engines. They operated at extreme temperatures. The exhaust valves in particular glowed red-hot. Over time, they burned out. They broke. They failed. Fedden sought greater power. He designed engines with 4 valves per cylinder, 2 intake, 2 exhaust. This improved airflow, but it also massively complicated the valve mechanism. And in radial engines, where the mechanism was already complex, adding more valves created a mechanical nightmare. In Fedden's own words, between 1925 and 1926, Harry Ricardo, one of England's most respected engineers, published a series of groundbreaking papers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Ricardo argued that poppet valves were already operating at the limits of their capabilities. Any future high-performance engine would need to use a different system: sleeve valves. Sleeve valves were conceptually simple but practically diabolical. Instead of valves that open and close, you have a cylindrical sleeve, essentially a tube, that moves between the piston and the cylinder wall. The sleeve has openings that periodically align with ports in the cylinder wall, allowing gases to enter and exit. The theory was elegant. It eliminated the entire complex mechanism of valves, springs, rods, and cams. It reduced moving parts. It should be simpler, but the practice was hellish. The sleeve needed to move with precision to within a fraction of a millimeter. It needed to seal perfectly against the cylinder walls. It needed to operate in extreme temperatures without seizing. Lubrication was critical. Too little, and it would seize; too much, and it would burn oil. Hundreds of engineers tried to make sleeve valves work. Almost all of them failed. Those who had some success produced engines that worked on test benches, but failed in real use. Roy Fedden read Ricardo's articles and immediately saw the potential. Sleeve valves could enable much more powerful engines. They could solve the problem of valve overheating. They could radically simplify the cylinder head. Fedden and Butler immediately began adapting their existing designs. The Mercury was adapted to become the Bristol Aquila. The Pegasus became the Bristol Perseus. Both would use sleeve valves. It was 1927. Fedden was betting the future of his division on a technology that almost no one had managed to make work. Many of his colleagues thought he had lost his mind. Bristol's own management was nervous, but Fedden was relentless. He worked obsessively. He tested hundreds of different configurations. He experimented with different materials, different lubricants, different tolerances. Every failure taught him something. Every problem was solved methodically. Leonard Butler translated Fedden's ideas into precise technical drawings. Mechanics at the Bristol factory manufactured prototypes. Engines were assembled, tested, disassembled, modified, and tested again. It was a brutal process of trial and error. It took years. But eventually, Fedden succeeded. The Bristol Perseus entered production in 1932. It was the world's first successful sleeve valve radial engine. It produced power equivalent to larger, heavier poppet engines. And it solved the problem of valve overheating. It was a monumental technical achievement. But it was only the beginning. Fedden now had proof that sleeve valves worked, and he wasn't going to stop with the Perseus. With the success of the Perseus, Fedden quickly realized that even larger engines were possible. The Perseus was a single-row 9-cylinder engine, but larger, heavier aircraft required more power. The solution was obvious: 2 rows of cylinders. 2-row radial engines already existed with poppet valves. But they were complex and heavy due to the double valve mechanism. With sleeve valves, a 2-row engine would be much simpler. Each cylinder needed only one sleeve. There was no complicated external valve mechanism. It was perfect. Fedden quickly adapted his designs. The 2-row Perseus became the Bristol Taurus. But more importantly, he created an entirely new engine based on the Pegasus, the Bristol Hercules. The Hercules would be the engine that would define World War II for Britain. It was a 14-cylinder radial engine, 2 rows of 7, with sleeve valves. It initially produced about 1,400 horsepower, extraordinary for its time. Work on the Hercules began in the late 1930s. When World War II began in September 1939, the engine was still undergoing testing. Fedden worked frantically to resolve the final problems. Every small improvement made a difference. The Hercules finally entered full production in 1940. It powered an extraordinary variety of British aircraft. The short Stirling, one of the RAF's first 4-engine heavy bombers. The Handley-Page Halifax, another crucial heavy bomber. The Bristol Beaufighter, a devastating night fighter that dominated the night skies over Europe. Each Hercules produced reliable power when other engines failed. Pilots relied on them. Mechanics could keep them running even in primitive field conditions. The engine was robust, durable, and remarkably reliable considering its complexity. But Fedden didn't stop there. While the Hercules was entering production, he was already working on something even bigger, the Bristol Centaurus. The Centaurus would be an 18-cylinder engine, 2 rows of 9. It would produce over 2,000 horsepower. It would be the most powerful radial engine ever built in Britain up to that time. Work on the Centaurus began in 1938, but when war broke out, it was suspended. All resources needed to be devoted to producing existing engines, especially the Hercules. There was no time or resources to develop speculative new designs. Fedden was frustrated. He could see the Centaurus's potential. He knew it would be necessary. But he had to accept the war priorities. For now, the Hercules was sufficient. What Fedden didn't know was that his own company was planning something that would devastate him. Bristol's board, the same people who had been reluctant to hire Fedden 20 years earlier, were tired of their stubborn and difficult engineering chief. In February 1942, at the height of the war, they would make a decision that would shock the British aircraft industry. Roy Fedden was brilliant, but he was also difficult, stubborn, impatient, with people who didn't share his obsession with technical perfection. The board of directors of the Bristol Aeroplane Company, controlled by the White family, always had a tense relationship with Fedden. They weren't technicians. They were business people, financiers, managers. They didn't fully understand Fedden's work, but they also felt Fedden was overstepping his bounds. Fedden didn't just focus on engine design. He was involved in manufacturing. He trained apprentices. He also worked in sales and marketing. He traveled the world promoting Bristol engines. He had strong opinions about company strategy, and he wasn't afraid to express those opinions, even when they conflicted with management. For Fedden, it was simple. Everything related to engines was his domain. If something affected quality or performance, he had the right to get involved. But to management, Fedden was challenging their authority. Tensions escalated throughout the 1930s. The British government repeatedly attempted to mediate. In 1931, the government suggested that Fedden be placed on Bristol's board of directors. The White family refused. They would not break their personal relationships by allowing an outsider onto the board. Then in February 1942, in the midst of World War II, with Hercules engines powering hundreds of RAF planes, with the Battle of Britain recently won, Bristol's board of directors made a surprising decision. They fired Roy Fedden. They gave him 6 months' notice, but they immediately stripped him of his authority. Fedden was effectively removed from the work he had built for 22 years. The news shocked the aviation industry. Roy Fedden was an internationally renowned figure. His engines were helping win the war. How could Bristol fire him now? The matter reached Parliament. Lord Brabazon of Tara, a respected member of the House of Lords and former Minister of Aircraft Production, raised the issue. In a debate on November 17, 1942, Brabazon expressed his displeasure at the dismissal. "It is a tragedy," said Brabazon, "that a great engineer, Sir Roy Fedden, has been dismissed from the Bristol Aeroplane Company. His association has been so long and successful." Brabazon argued that quantity wasn't everything in engine production. Quality was even more important. And Fedden represented quality, inspiration, and innovation. But the decision was made. The White family would not back down. Fedden had to leave. For Fedden, it was devastating, not because of the loss of his salary. He was financially comfortable. But because of the loss of his job, because of the loss of his team, because of the loss of his projects, especially the Centaurus, which he had started but couldn't finish. Fedden departed Bristol in August 1942. But the story didn't end there. The British government recognized Fedden's worth, and it had other plans for him. When Roy Fedden left the Bristol Aeroplane Company in August 1942, the Minister of Aircraft Production, Stafford Cripps, immediately recruited him as a special advisor. Cripps recognized that Fedden possessed knowledge and experience few others possessed. And in wartime, Britain could not afford to waste talent. Fedden accepted the position, not out of pride or revenge against Bristol, but because his nation needed him. And Fedden, despite all his personal flaws, was deeply patriotic. As a consultant to the ministry, Fedden visited aircraft engine factories throughout Great Britain. He identified production problems. He suggested improvements. He shared his expertise with other companies struggling with their own engine designs. Ironically, one of those companies was Napier, which was having terrible problems with its Sabre engine. The Sabre was an H-24 engine, essentially two V12s sharing a common crankshaft that used sleeve valves. The concept was promising, but Napier couldn't get it to work reliably. The Air Ministry forced a reluctant Bristol to help Napier with its knowledge of sleeve valves. And although Fedden was no longer officially at Bristol, his previous work and expertise were instrumental in solving the Sabre's problems. The Sabre eventually became one of the most powerful engines of the war, powering the Hawker Typhoon and Hawker Tempest, two devastating fighters, but only after incorporating lessons Fedden had learned during years of developing the Perseus and Hercules. By 1941, with Hercules production in full swing, Fedden had returned to development of the Centaurus. The 18-cylinder engine promised to be extraordinary, but without Fedden directly overseeing it, progress slowed. Still, the Centaurus finally entered production in 1943. It powered aircraft such as the Hawker Tempest II and the Hawker Sea Fury, the latter considered by many to be the finest piston-engine fighter ever built. The Centaurus produced over 2,500 horsepower in its final versions. It was robust, reliable, and extraordinarily powerful. Pilots loved it. It was the culmination of 2 decades of Fedden's work on sleeve valves, but Fedden didn't receive full credit. Bristol promoted the engine. Bristol received the profits. Fedden's name was largely omitted from the publicity. For someone who had dedicated his life to these engines, it was another blow. But Fedden wasn't one to complain publicly. He continued his consulting work. He continued contributing to the war effort, and then, in May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Germany was defeated. The engines Fedden had designed, the Hercules, the Taurus, and eventually the Centaurus, had played a crucial role in that victory. But Fedden's work wasn't done yet. There was one last mission, and it would be one of the most important of his career. In June 1945, just weeks after the end of the war in Europe, Roy Fedden led an extraordinary scientific mission to defeated Germany. The Fedden mission, as it became known, was organized by Stafford Cripps, then Minister of Aircraft Production. Its objective was to collect technical intelligence on German aircraft and aircraft engines. The mission consisted of Fedden, Dr. W.J. Duncan, Professor of Aeronautics, J.C. King, Structural Engineering Specialist, Flight Lieutenant A.B.P. Beaton, Engine Specialist, and Bert Newport, Propeller Specialist. They traveled in 2 RAF Dakotas, each carrying a jeep that could unload in just 10 minutes. The Germans had made extraordinary advances in aircraft technology during the war. Jet engines, rockets, advanced aerodynamic designs. The Allies knew this, but they needed the details. The mission visited dozens of locations: Völkenrode, Braunschweig, Dessau, Munich, and many others. At each location, they encountered looting by Allied troops and German civilians, and sabotage by German factory workers and the German army itself, under Hitler's orders. At the Hermann Göring Institute in Völkenrode, Germany's most secretive aeronautical research facility, Fedden examined advanced wind tunnels. He found evidence of research into jet engines, turbine blade cooling, blade construction, including hollow and ceramic types, and other subjects. The mission examined BMW facilities, where Fedden personally examined forgings of compressor blades and a turbine blade for the BMW 018 high-thrust jet engine project. In Dessau, the headquarters of Junkers Flugzeug- und Motorenwerke, Fedden spoke with the technical director responsible for the development of the Junkers Jumo 213, a liquid-cooled inverted V12 engine that powered many late German fighters. Everywhere the mission went, Fedden took meticulous notes. He photographed equipment. He interviewed German engineers. He collected technical documentation. The amount of information was impressive, but there was also a bitter irony. Fedden saw that the Germans had made significant advances in jet engine technology, a technology Fedden had initially resisted. During the war, Fedden had championed piston engines, arguing that they still had much development ahead of them. He was right that piston engines were still relevant. The Centaurus had proven that. But it was also clear that the future belonged to jets. The piston engine era was ending. After weeks in Germany, the Fedden mission returned to England with mountains of technical intelligence. Fedden's report influenced post-war British aeronautical development. German technologies were studied, adapted, and incorporated into British designs. The Fedden mission was one of the most important technical intelligence-gathering efforts of the late war. And Fedden, the dismissed engineer, the reluctant consultant, was at the center of it. It was recognition, finally, of his worth. But it was recognition that came too late to save his career at Bristol. That chapter was closed. While Fedden was in Germany hunting for secrets, his engines kept running. And the numbers tell an impressive story. The Bristol Hercules was produced in massive numbers during the war. Approximately 57,000 Hercules engines were built between 1939 and 1945. They powered aircraft in all theaters of war: Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The short Stirling, the RAF's first four-engine heavy bomber, used 4 Hercules. These bombers attacked targets deep inside Germany when other bombers lacked the range. The Handley-Page Halifax, another crucial heavy bomber, also used Hercules. Halifaxes flew more than 75,000 operational missions during the war, dropping millions of tons of bombs. And each mission relied on 4 perfectly functioning Hercules engines. The Bristol Beaufighter, equipped with 2 Hercules, became one of the most effective night fighters of the war. German pilots feared it. Its combination of speed, heavy firepower, and reliability made it lethal. The Centaurus, although entering production late in the war, also proved to be extraordinary. The Centaurus-equipped Hawker Tempest II was faster than almost any fighter of the time. It could pursue and destroy the V-1 rockets that terrorized London in 1944. The Hawker Sea Fury, perhaps the finest piston engine fighter ever built, used the Centaurus. It entered service too late for World War II, but would be used extensively in the Korean War. Sea Fury pilots even shot down the new Soviet MiG-15 jets, an extraordinary achievement for a piston-engine aircraft. But beyond the production numbers and combat statistics, there was something deeper. The concept Fedden had championed against all the skeptics was fully validated. Sleeve valves worked. They weren't just viable, they were superior. They produced more power with less weight. They were more reliable. They solved the valve overheating problem that limited conventional engines. When Harry Ricardo wrote in 1925 that sleeve valves were the future, few believed him. When Fedden began his work in 1927, many thought he was chasing a fantasy. But Fedden had proved them wrong. During the war, other countries attempted to develop their own sleeve valve engines. The United States developed the Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Major, the largest mass-produced piston engine in history, with 28 cylinders. But it used conventional poppet valves. It was a maintenance nightmare. Only Great Britain has completely mastered sleeve valve technology. And this was almost entirely thanks to Roy Fedden and his team. After the war, in 1945, Fedden was knighted for his contributions to aviation. Sir Roy Fedden, it was official recognition. But it came with bittersweet accolades, recognition from the government, but not from the company where he had worked for 22 years. Fedden never returned to Bristol. The bridge was burned, but he continued working as a consultant. He wrote technical papers. He gave lectures. He shared his expertise. In 1953, at the age of 68, Fedden suffered a severe stroke. His health declined rapidly. On November 12, 1973, Sir Roy Fedden died at the age of 88. His obituary in the Times of London acknowledged his contributions. Sir Roy Fedden was one of the great pioneers of the aircraft engine. His designs, particularly the Hercules, played a crucial role in the Allied victory in the Second World War. But even this recognition was limited. Few outside the aviation industry knew the name Roy Fedden. His engines were famous, but the man behind them remained largely unknown. Roy Fedden's story offers profound lessons about innovation, perseverance, and the price of being a pioneer. First lesson: believe in the impossible. When Fedden began working on sleeve valves in 1927, almost every expert said it was impossible. Hundreds of engineers had tried and failed. The design was theoretically elegant but practically impractical. Fedden didn't accept this verdict. He believed that if the theory worked, the practice could be found. It just took enough work, enough testing, enough persistence. It took 5 years, from 1927 to 1932, to get Perseus working reliably. 5 years of repeated failures. 5 years where many would have given up. But Fedden didn't give up. This is the first mark of true genius, the ability to keep going when everyone else gives up. Not out of blind stubbornness, but out of conviction grounded in deep technical understanding. Second lesson: technical perfection has a personal price. Fedden was notoriously difficult to work with. He held himself to impossible standards. He expected everyone to share his obsession with technical excellence. When people failed to meet his standards, he was impatient and critical. This made him respected, but not loved, admired, but not popular, and eventually it cost him his job. Bristol's management didn't fire him for technical incompetence. They fired him because they couldn't work with him. There's a tension here that many geniuses face. The same qualities that make someone extraordinary in their field: obsession, perfectionism, intolerance of mediocrity, often make them difficult as people. Fedden never resolved this tension. He remained obstinate to the end. But he also remained brilliant to the end. Lesson 3. Radical innovation takes time. Our modern culture celebrates rapid disruption, but Fedden's work shows that true technical innovation often requires years, even decades, of patient development. The sleeve valve concept had existed since the early 20th century, but it took until 1932 for Fedden to make it work reliably. And it took until the late 1930s for it to be scaled up to twin-row engines, like the Hercules. That's 15 years of development. 15 years of incremental improvements, problem-solving, refinement. There was no shortcut. There was no magic hack. Just hard, systematic work. In an age of instant gratification and accelerated development cycles, Fedden's patience is instructive. Lesson 4. Technical legacy survives corporate politics. The Bristol Aeroplane Company fired Fedden. It downplayed his contributions. It tried to erase his name from the history of the engines he created, but it didn't work. Anyone who seriously studies World War II aircraft engines knows the name Roy Fedden. They know that the Hercules and Centaurus were essentially his engines. They know that sleeve valve technology was validated by his work. A true technical legacy cannot be erased by corporate policies. The truth eventually emerges. Fedden didn't receive full recognition during his lifetime, but he did receive it in history. 80 years after Roy Fedden proved that sleeve valves worked, his legacy remains visible, albeit in unexpected ways. Sleeve valve radial engines like the Hercules and Centaurus are no longer in production. The era of the piston engine for military aviation ended with the advent of jets. Today, military aircraft use jet engines or turboprops. None use sleeve valve radial engines, but that doesn't mean Fedden's work has been forgotten or irrelevant. First, historic aircraft still fly with Fedden engines. The Bristol Beaufighter, the Hawker Sea Fury, the short Stirling. Surviving examples are held by museums and collectors. When these planes fly at air shows, the distinctive sound of a sleeve valve radial engine enchants crowds. There's something visceral about that sound, a deep, resonant roar, unlike any modern engine. It's the sound of a bygone era, and it's also the sound of Fedden's genius made audible. Second, the principles Fedden developed remain relevant. Although sleeve valves are no longer used in modern aviation, the fundamental problem Fedden solved, how to move large volumes of air through high-performance combustion engines, remains central to engine design. Modern engines use different solutions: fuel injection, turbos and superchargers, electronic control, but they all face the same fundamental physical laws that Fedden faced. And some of his solutions, such as optimized airflow geometry, still influence modern design. Third, Fedden's story continues to inspire engineers. His persistence in the face of universal doubt, his refusal to accept impossible as an answer, his obsession with technical excellence. These are qualities any engineer can admire and aspire to. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, includes the development of the Bristol Hercules in its engineering history classes. It's used as an example of how solving fundamental technical problems requires not just intelligence but systematic persistence over years. Rolls-Royce, the successor to the Bristol Aeroplane Company after several mergers, maintains historical archives of Fedden engines. Engineers occasionally consult these archives when working on new designs, seeking insights from past solutions. In Bristol, the city where Fedden lived and worked for decades, there is a discreet memorial. A plaque in Filton, where the Bristol engine factory was located, recognizes Roy Fedden and his team for their contributions to British aviation. It's a modest recognition for a man whose work helped win a war. But perhaps it's fitting. Fedden didn't seek the spotlight. He sought technical perfection, and in this he succeeded extraordinarily. Today, when engineers face seemingly insoluble problems, when everyone says something is impossible, when conventional wisdom says to give up, they can look to Roy Fedden. Fedden faced the impossible. He worked when others gave up. He persisted when others said he was crazy. And he proved that the impossible was simply difficult. The Bristol Hercules flew over 500,000 combat missions. It saved countless lives. It helped defeat Nazism. And it all started with a stubborn engineer who refused to accept that sleeve valves were impossible. That's the true mark of genius. Not just solving problems, but solving the problems that no one else believes can be solved. Roy Fedden was difficult. He was stubborn. He was fired by the company he built. But he was also brilliant. He was persistent. And he was right. And in the end, being right is what matters.